My hands were shaking before I even understood why. I was standing at the host stand of my own restaurant, watching my son-in-law slide my card back across the table to the waitress with 2 fingers, like it was something dirty. "This one's declined," he said, loud enough for the table behind him to hear. "Try mine instead." 63 seconds. That's how long I stood there before anyone noticed I'd walked in the back entrance, still in my apron, flowers still dusted on my forearms from the afternoon prep. I had absolutely no idea, in that moment, that I was about to watch my own daughter's husband perform a small public execution using a card that couldn't have declined, because I own every terminal, every lease, every square foot of the building he was sitting in. Not to me. To her. That's who he said it to. Not to the waitress. Not really. He said it loud enough for my daughter to hear, and loud enough for the 4 other people at that table, his business partner, his business partner's wife, and 2 men I didn't recognize in the kind of blazers that cost more than my monthly mortgage used to hear it too. "Some people just aren't built for this level of dining," he said, and he laughed the way men laugh when they want a room to laugh with them. I stood behind the server station with a tray of bread in my hands, and I felt the exact moment the floor of the room shifted under everyone but me. I need you to understand what was actually at stake that night, because on the surface it looked like an embarrassing moment over a declined card. It wasn't. What was actually at stake was 5 years of my life, every relationship I had left, and whether my daughter was going to spend the next 20 years married to a man who saw both of us as furniture he hadn't gotten around to replacing yet. I had no idea, standing there with that bread tray, that in about 11 days I was going to be the calmest person in a room while his entire architecture of lies came down around him in front of the very people he'd invited to watch him humiliate me. Neither did he. My name is Renata Cole. I'm 35 years old, and I own a restaurant called Marchetti's on the corner of 9th and Delancey, in a mid-sized city most people wouldn't be able to point on a map, but that everyone in the restaurant industry around here knows by name. I built it from a lease on a failing pizza place when I was 26 years old, 6 months pregnant, and completely on my own. I want to tell you the whole story properly because none of what happened later makes any sense without understanding where I came from, and because I think the parts of my life that came before Trent are, in their own way, the reason I was able to survive him. I had my daughter, Isla, when I was 17. Her father was gone before she took her first breath, not dead, just gone. The way some men are simply gone, like weather that passed through and left wreckage but no forwarding address. I remember the specific texture of that year with more clarity than I remember most of my 30s, which tells you something about how deeply the body files away its first true wounds. I remember the smell of the apartment above the laundromat, a permanent low hum of fabric softener and bleach that seeped into the carpets, into the crib sheets, into my own hair no matter how many times I washed it. I remember the sound of the dryers running at all hours, a steady mechanical breathing beneath the floorboards that I eventually found comforting instead of intrusive, because it meant I wasn't the only one awake. My mother didn't speak to me for the first year. Not out of cruelty, she'd tell you now, but out of fear, the kind that comes out sideways as anger, because it's easier to be furious at your daughter than to admit you're terrified for her. I understand that now, at 35, in a way I couldn't at 17. At 17, it just felt like being handed a baby and a locked door in the same week. I raised Isla in that 1-bedroom apartment for 2 years before I could afford anything better, and I worked the line at 3 different restaurants over the following 8 years, learning everything with my hands because nobody was going to teach me with words. I learned to dice an onion so fast the tips of my fingers went numb to the blade, learned it the way you learn anything out of necessity rather than instruction. Badly at first, bleeding more than once into a towel I kept folded under the cutting board specifically for that purpose, and then, gradually, correctly, until the knife became an extension of my hand instead of a threat to it. I learned which vendors would extend credit to a kid with a baby on her hip, and which ones would slam the walk-in door before you got a foot in. I learned the particular cruelty of a Sunday morning when you have $11 until Wednesday and a toddler who needs formula, and the particular relief of a Good Friday night that could stretch that $11 into $80. I learned that the difference between surviving and drowning in this business is usually about $400 and one good week, over and over again for years. My hands still carry the map of that decade. A burn scar along my left forearm shaped almost like a comma. From a sheet pan I pulled too fast out of a 450-degree oven when Isla was 2, and crying in her high chair in the back office, and I rushed. Knuckles that ache before rain the way older women's knuckles ache. Though I'm not old, not yet, I just paid for my 30s in advance during my 20s, the way so many of us do, without anyone telling us that's the transaction we've agreed to. The wound that made me who I am isn't dramatic, and I want to be honest about that because I think dramatic wounds are easier to talk about than quiet ones. Quiet ones are the ones that actually run your whole life. When Isla was 4 years old, her father's mother, a woman named Deb who I hadn't seen in 3 years, who had made exactly one phone call in that time, on Isla's first birthday, to say she was praying for us, showed up at the restaurant where I was working a double shift, sat down at the bar in a coat that smelled like someone else's cigarette smoke, and told me, without any preamble, that Isla deserved a real family, and that she and her husband had been discussing whether they should step in. I remember the exact time. It was 6:40 in the evening on a Thursday in October, and I remember it because the ticket printer at the bar jammed twice while she was talking and I had to keep excusing myself mid-sentence to go clear it, my hands moving through the mechanical motions of unjamming register paper while my chest did something I didn't have a name for yet. And each time I came back, she picked up exactly where she'd left off. Like my daughter's whole future was a conversation that could be paused and resumed at her convenience, like I was an inconvenience interrupting the real business of deciding my child's fate. I didn't scream at her. I want you to understand that I have never, not once in my life, found that screaming gets me anything I actually want. I finished my shift 4 more hours, 2 more tables, a bar close that took longer than usual because my hands weren't quite steady on the register, and drove home with the windows down even though it was cold, because I needed the air on my face to feel like something other than the inside of my own skull. I stood in my kitchen at midnight and made myself a single promise, out loud, to the empty room, because some promises need to be spoken to be real. Nobody would ever again be in a position to look at what I'd built with my daughter and decide it wasn't enough. I would build something so undeniable, so structurally sound, that no one could threaten to take her from me, financially or otherwise, ever again. That promise is the entire architecture of my adult life. Every decision I've made since then, buying the pizza place at 26, working 18-hour days for 2 years straight to convert it, refusing every loan with strings attached even when the strings would have made things easier in the short term, keeping every deed and lease and LLC filing in a fireproof box instead of a filing cabinet, learning to read a profit and loss statement the way other people learn to read novels, for pleasure and fluency both, traces back to that woman at the bar telling me my daughter deserved better than me. Isla is 19 now. She's beautiful in the specific way that comes from watching your mother work herself to the bone and deciding you'll never let anyone see you as anything less than exceptional. She's smart, she's proud, and she is, if I'm honest with myself the way this story requires me to be, a little bit susceptible to men who present as having already arrived somewhere because she spent her whole childhood watching me still be on the way. I've thought about that a great deal since everything happened. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think children absorb the shape of their parents' unfinished business and go looking, unconsciously, for whatever seems to promise the ending their parents never got to. That's how she met Trent. Trent Holloway is 28. He wears the kind of quarter-zip sweaters that look casual and cost $200, and he has a talking voice, a slightly lower register he switches into whenever he's addressing more than 3 people that I noticed the very first time I met him and dismissed as nerves. It wasn't nerves. It was a performance he'd rehearsed enough times that it had become load-bearing, the way a person's fake laugh eventually becomes the only laugh they have left. I met him for the first time at a coffee shop Isla chose specifically because it had good lighting, which should have told me something about how carefully she was staging this introduction, how much she needed it to go well. He shook my hand with a grip that was 1 full degree too firm, held 1/2 second too long, the kind of handshake that isn't about greeting you, but about establishing something before either of you has said a word. I remember thinking even then that it felt less like a hello and more like a measurement. The first time I really saw him, the way you see a hairline crack in a foundation and choose to believe it's just the paint, was at a family dinner about 8 months before the wedding. He'd asked, casually over dessert, whether Marchetti's was doing all right these days. And when I said business was strong, he nodded slowly and said, "That's good. That's good. Restaurants are so unpredictable. It's smart you've got Isla's side of things figured out separately." I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange thing to say, almost proprietary, the way you talk about an asset you were quietly assessing rather than a mother-in-law you respected. I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd earned a habit of suspicion the way you earn calluses, honestly, and through repeated injury, but that it didn't mean every hand reaching toward me was reaching to take something. There were other small moments, too, in the months that followed, that I filed away without examining too closely, the way you notice a draft in a house without checking every window. He always paid for the smallest thing at dinner, a round of appetizers, never the whole bill, while making sure everyone at the table clocked that he'd reached for his wallet first. He referred to his own ventures in vague, expansive language. We're scaling into a new vertical, the fun's about to hit an inflection point, that never quite resolved into anything I could picture concretely, the way honest work usually resolves into something you can picture, a menu, a build site, a client roster. And once, only once, I walked into Isla and Trent's apartment unannounced to drop off a dish I'd forgotten to give her at dinner, and I saw him slide his phone face down on the counter in a motion so smooth it was clearly practiced before he even turned to see who'd walked in. I was wrong to let all of it go, but I understand, looking back, exactly why I did. Isla was happy. Genuinely, visibly happy, in a way I hadn't seen since she was small enough to still believe I could fix anything with a hug and a grilled cheese sandwich. And some part of me, the part that still carried Deb's voice from that bar stool 15 years earlier, desperately wanted proof that my daughter had ended up with someone who saw her as more than an inheritance of my hard work. I wanted to believe Trent so badly that I helped him lie to me. I want to say that plainly because I think it's the part of this story that other people in my position need to hear the most. Sometimes we aren't fooled because we're foolish. We're fooled because we're hungry for a specific kind of proof, and a clever person can smell that hunger and feed it exactly enough to keep us quiet. The explicit insult, the one I couldn't explain away with paranoia or forgiveness, came at their engagement dinner, 6 weeks before the wedding, at a restaurant Trent chose specifically, not mine, one across town with white tablecloths and a wine list that required its own reading glasses. His business partner, a man named Corwin, was there, along with Corwin's wife, and 2 associates from whatever venture Trent kept vaguely describing as diversified consulting. I paid for that dinner. I want to be very clear about that because it matters later. I paid for it, quietly, by prearranging the check with the manager before we arrived, because I wanted the night to feel easy for Isla. No tension, no calculating who owed what, no chance of an awkward moment over the bill marring what should have been a joyful evening. Halfway through the appetizers, Trent leaned back in his chair, gestured toward me with his wine glass in a motion that was somehow both casual and performative, and said to Corwin, "Renata here runs a little Italian place downtown. Family business, very sweet." Little, very sweet. 2 words that, spoken in any other context, would be harmless, and spoken in that context, in that voice, in front of those men, were a public demotion of everything I'd built from a woman he wanted them to see as a hobbyist to be tolerated at the head of the table. Corwin nodded politely, the nod of a man filing away a piece of information he'd already decided didn't matter, and one of the 2 associates, a younger man with a particular restlessness of someone who wanted to be talking about something else, said, "That's nice," in the tone people use for things they've already stopped listening to. I didn't correct him. I smiled, and I let the moment pass, because that is what dignity has always looked like for me. Not because I don't feel the sting, but because I've learned, the hard way, that reacting in the moment gives the wrong people exactly what they want, which is evidence that you're unstable, emotional, difficult. I have watched too many women lose credibility in a room because they responded to condescension with the volume it deserved instead of the silence it feared. So I smiled, and I let him have his little moment of superiority in front of his associates, and I told myself, the way I always do, that time reveals people, and I would simply wait. I had no idea how quickly time would oblige. The night at the restaurant, my restaurant, Marchetti's, happened on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays are our slowest night, which is precisely why Trent chose it. He'd booked a table for 6 under Corwin's name instead of his own, which I only learned later was deliberate so that the staff wouldn't flag it up to me, because by then he'd apparently decided that if I saw the reservation coming, I might interfere with whatever performance he had planned. I came in around 7 p.m., not because I suspected anything, but because Tuesdays are when I do inventory in the walk-in, counting cases of San Marzano tomatoes and blocks of Parmesan with a clipboard under my arm, still wearing my apron from home where I'd been prepping sauce for the week, the smell of garlic and basil still clinging to my hands even after washing them twice. I heard raised laughter from the dining room. Not unusual. We get lively tables, and I might have stayed in the back entirely if I hadn't heard my daughter's name. I came around the corner of the server station with a tray of bread I'd grabbed on the way, more out of habit than intention, my hands already moving before my brain caught up to what I was seeing. Trent was at the head of the table, and Isla was beside him, and across from them sat Corwin and his wife and the 2 men in the expensive blazers, and in the center of the table sat the black leather check presenter, open, with a card resting inside it, face up, so everyone could see whose name was on it. The card said Renata Cole. My name. My card, the corporate one, the one that draws from the restaurant's own operating account, a card Trent should never have had access to in the first place, and the fact that he did have it, that he'd apparently lifted it from my purse or my desk at some point in the preceding days, was a detail I filed away in the coldest, most precise part of my mind even as the rest of me was still catching up to the scene. This one's declined, Trent said to the waitress, sliding the leather folder back toward her with 2 fingers, the exact gesture you'd use to return a plate that had arrived cold. Try mine instead. He pulled his own card from his breast pocket with a small flourish, like a magician revealing the second half of a trick. The waitress, her name is Priya, she's worked for me for 2 years, and I watched her face very carefully in that half-second because I trust her instincts more than almost anyone's, hesitated.
Just barely.
Because Priya knew, the way anyone who processes a register every night for 2 years knows, that the card Trent had just declared declined was tied to an account that had cleared $400,000 in gross revenue in the last 12 months alone, an account I checked myself, personally, every single morning with coffee in hand before the sun was fully up. That card does not decline. That card has never declined. Priya knew that. She just didn't know what to do with knowing it while her boss's son-in-law was making a scene in front of 5 people who were clearly, by every social cue in the room, exactly the audience he wanted watching. Some people just aren't built for this level of dining, Trent said, and he laughed, and Corwin laughed with him a half-beat late, the laugh of a man following a cue rather than feeling something funny, and the 2 associates chuckled the way people chuckle at their boss's joke regardless of content, and Isla, my Isla, laughed too, a small, uncertain laugh, the laugh of someone who has learned that agreeing with the joke is safer than being the joke. That was the moment my hands went cold, not metaphorically. Actually cold, in a room that was 72 degrees, in July, holding a warm tray of bread that I could suddenly barely feel against my own palms. Everything got slow. Everything got quiet, the specific quiet where you can hear the individual clink of ice in someone's water glass 3 tables away like it's happening inside your own skull, where the low murmur of the rest of the dining room seemed to recede behind glass. I have felt this exact stillness twice before in my life. Once when Isla's father told me, over the phone, that he wasn't coming back from his trip, and once, 15 years later, when Deb told me my daughter deserved a real family. The third time is always the one that teaches you something if you're paying attention. I was determined to pay attention. I set the bread tray down on the server station, quietly, and I walked toward the table. I want to tell you honestly that my first instinct was not composure. My first instinct was the animal one. The one that wanted to slam that check presenter shut and say, in front of everyone, that the card had not, in fact, declined, that the card belonged to a woman who could buy the restaurant Trent had chosen for the engagement dinner and everyone in it 3 times over without touching her savings. I wanted to watch his face, do what I knew it would do. But I have spent 18 years teaching myself that the instinct to explode in the moment is almost always the instinct that costs you the most later, and I have never once regretted swallowing it, and I have regretted, deeply and specifically, every single time in my younger years that I didn't. So instead, I smiled. The same smile I give a difficult customer who's about to become an easy one, and I said, "Actually, that card's fine. Let me just check the terminal. We've had some sync issues today." Which was a lie, a small one, a graceful one, the kind of lie that gives everyone at that table a way to save face while I quietly, deliberately, chose not to detonate the truth in front of an audience I hadn't personally selected. Trent's eyes flicked to me. A half-second of something unguarded, a flash of recalculation, gone almost as fast as it arrived, before he smoothed it back into the easy, superior expression he'd been wearing for Corwin's benefit. "Oh, Renata. Didn't realize you were working tonight," he said, and there it was again, that word, working, delivered with the faintest emphasis, as though I were staff who'd wandered too close to the good tables. "I own the place, Trent," I said, lightly, almost warmly, like I was sharing a fun fact rather than correcting a public humiliation. "I'm always working." I took the check presenter from Priya's hands myself, opened it, looked at my own card sitting there, declined, according to a 28-year-old who'd apparently taken it upon himself to test whether a card could be declined by simply announcing that it was, and I looked up at Corwin and his wife and the two men in blazers and I said, "This one's on the house tonight. Family discount." And I smiled and I walked away, and I let every single person at that table sit with whatever they wanted to make of that sentence. I did not confront Trent that night. I did not pull Isla aside in the bathroom and tell her what her husband had just done. I went back to the walk-in, finished my inventory count with a clipboard that shook slightly in my hands for the first 10 minutes and then didn't shake at all, and I drove home at 11:40 p.m. and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside, not crying, just breathing, letting my body do whatever it needed to do with what it had just witnessed before I let it reach my face. Here is what I understood, sitting in that driveway. Trent had not made a mistake. Mistakes are singular, apologized for, corrected. What I had just watched was a demonstration, a performance for an audience of men he apparently needed to impress, using my card, my restaurant, and my daughter's discomfort as the props. Which meant this wasn't the first time he'd rehearsed some version of diminishing me. It was simply the first time I'd been in the room to see it land. I decided in that driveway that I was not going to react. I was going to find out exactly what Trent Holloway was, and exactly what he needed from Corwin and those two men badly enough that he'd used my restaurant as a stage set to prove something to them. I have learned, in 35 years of being underestimated by people who assumed my softness was my whole personality, that the smartest response to being tested in public is never to react in public. It's to go quiet, go patient, and go looking. The next morning I called Marisol Reyes, and I go back 9 years, to when she was a line cook at the first place I ever managed, and I was a 26-year-old kid who'd just signed a lease she had no business signing. She left the kitchen world eventually and went into forensic accounting, a strange pivot that she'll tell you if you ask her over a drink, was directly inspired by watching too many restaurant owners get quietly bled dry by business partners who understood spreadsheets better than they understood loyalty. She's 44 now, sharp in the particular way of someone who spent a decade learning to read a room full of men who assumed she wasn't listening, and she has saved 3 different friends of mine from financial disasters they didn't know they were standing inside of. I told her what happened at the restaurant, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us, because neither of us remembered to drink them. She was quiet for a long moment on hearing it, turning her mug slowly in a circle on the table without lifting it, and then she said the sentence that reframed the entire next 11 days of my life. "Renata, a 28-year-old doesn't perform status for an audience unless he's actively trying to convince that audience he already has something he doesn't have yet. Men who've actually arrived don't need witnesses. Only men who are still selling something need an audience." I sat with that sentence the way you sit with a splinter you've just located under the skin, carefully, aware of exactly where it hurts, unwilling to dig until you understand the angle. "What is he selling them?" I asked. "That's what we're going to find out," Marisol said. "Give me a week. Don't say anything to Isla yet. Don't say anything to him. Just keep being exactly who you've always been, soft on the surface, iron underneath, the way you've always run that restaurant. Let him keep thinking he's ahead." For the next 11 days, I performed the most exhausting normalcy of my adult life. I went to Sunday dinner at Isla and Trent's apartment and complimented the roast chicken she'd clearly followed a recipe card for, step by nervous step, tasting the slightly underseasoned gravy and telling her it was wonderful because it was, in its own trying way, and because that particular kind of trying deserved encouragement regardless of anything else happening beneath the surface. I laughed at Trent's jokes about his big deal closing soon, and I hugged him goodbye at the door with the same warmth I'd have given him a year earlier, before I understood what he was. I made coffee every morning in my own kitchen and drank it alone, looking out at the small backyard I'd bought with the down payment from Marchetti's second good year, and I thought about how strange it is that a body can carry a full secret and still show up, smiling, to a Sunday dinner and pass the potatoes and ask about somebody's week. Marisol called me on day 4 with the first piece of the picture. Corwin Ashby wasn't, as Trent had described him, a business partner in a fund. Corwin was the operator of something called Ashby Capital Growth Partners, a private investment vehicle that, according to state filings Marisol pulled, had exactly one address, a UPS store mailbox, and exactly one prior legal action against it, a cease and desist from the State Securities Division 18 months earlier for soliciting investment without proper registration. It's not necessarily illegal on its face, Marisol told me, her voice careful in the specific way she gets when she's trying not to alarm someone before she has the full picture, but it's the exact shape of a fund that recruits its early investors from the founder's own social circle before regulators catch up to it. Family, friends, in-laws. She let that last word sit there deliberately, and I felt it land the way she intended it to. I felt the fear arrive quietly then. Not fear about Trent's contempt for me, which I could absorb, but fear about what he might have already convinced Isla to sign, or what he might be about to ask her to sign, using her name, her modest savings, or worse, using access to something of mine that she might innocently have shared with him in the trusting, unguarded way daughters share things with husbands they believe are on their side. On day 7, Marisol found the piece that made my hands go cold a second time. She'd been going through publicly available business filings connected to Ashby Capital and found a supplemental investor document, not confidential, just poorly hidden, the way people who are used to getting away with things get sloppy about hiding them, that listed prospective investor commitments still being finalized. Under a section labeled Family and Friends Round, Anticipated Q3 Closings, there was a line item. Trent H. Restaurant Equity Leverage, EST $180,000. No further detail. Just those 5 words sitting on a spreadsheet like they belonged there, like my life's work had been quietly converted into a projected cash figure without my knowledge or consent. I read it 4 times before I understood what it meant. Trent had told Corwin and his associates that he had access to leverage against restaurant equity, my restaurant equity, to the tune of $180,000, and he had apparently told them this with enough confidence that Corwin had entered it into a projection document as an anticipated closing, which meant Trent had either already begun forging some paper trail suggesting he had access to my assets, or he was planning to acquire that access through Isla, through her name being added to something, a loan, a line of credit, a deed, anything that would give him a legal thread to pull. I called Isla that night, not to alarm her, but because I needed one piece of information only she could give me. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, sitting on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my ear and my heart doing something uneven in my chest, whether Trent had ever asked her to sign anything related to the restaurant, a form, a document, anything with my name or Marchetti's name on it. There was a pause on the line, longer than I liked, and then she said, "He mentioned something a few weeks ago about a form for a small business loan program, something about how it would help if I co-signed since I'm family, but I never actually signed it, Mom. I told him I wanted you to look at it first, and he said he'd handle it, and I guess he never brought it back up." I did not raise my voice. I said, "That's smart, baby. Always let me look at anything with the restaurant's name on it before you sign, okay? Just have it." And she said okay, easily, without alarm, and we talked about something else, and I hung up the phone and sat in the dark of my kitchen for a long time, grateful in a way I can't fully describe that some instinct in my daughter had already, without knowing why, protected herself from the very thing I was still gathering proof of. Here is the decision I made that night, the decision not to react immediately, the The decision that Marisol helped me understand was the only correct one. If I confronted Trent directly, alone, he would simply deny it, apologize with practiced sincerity, and go further underground with whatever he was building, likely accelerating his timeline before I could gather anything solid enough to matter. If I told Isla everything at once, and proven, I risked putting her in the position of choosing between her mother's word and her husband's denial, a position no 19-year-old should be forced into, and a position that, if I'm honest, Deb had once tried to put me in from the other direction, all those years ago at that bar. I would not do to my daughter what had once been threatened against me. I needed proof solid enough that there would be no version of events left for anyone to argue about. So Marisol and I built the case the way she'd learned to in her career, methodically, unglamorously, one document at a time. She pulled the full investor deck Ashby Capital had been circulating, which listed, in small print on page 14, a disclosure that certain family-adjacent capital sources are being formalized. Language a securities lawyer we later consulted told us was almost certainly written by someone who knew exactly how thin the ice was and wanted deniability built in from the start. I went through my own restaurant's paperwork with a fine-tooth comb, checking every account, every authorized signer, every card issued in the last 2 years, and found, tucked in a drawer of my office desk that I rarely opened, a printed and partially filled business loan cosigner form with Isla's name typed in the applicant field and a blank signature line. Proof he had, in fact, prepared the document, even if he hadn't yet gotten her to sign it. I photographed it, dated, with my phone's camera timestamp turned on, at exactly 9:14 in the morning on a Thursday, because Marisol had told me, more than once, that exact times make evidence feel undeniable in ways vague memories never do. The most damning piece came from Priya, of all people. She approached me quietly one afternoon during a slow lunch service, wiping her hands on her apron in the way she does when she's working up to saying something uncomfortable, and told me that a few weeks earlier, before the engagement dinner, Trent had come into the restaurant alone, asked to see me, and when told I was out running errands, had asked Priya, casually, the way you'd ask a favor from someone you assumed had no power to refuse you, whether she could grab him a spare terminal receipt or 2 from the register, just for his files. Priya, sharp enough to sense something wrong even without understanding what, had told him she wasn't authorized to do that without my approval, and he'd shrugged it off and left. She hadn't thought much of it until the night of the declined card, when it clicked into place for her exactly as it clicked into place for me. He had been laying groundwork, quietly, for weeks, to construct paperwork suggesting financial entanglement between his ventures and my restaurant's accounts. I want to be honest about something here because the life lesson at the center of the story only means anything if I am. There was a night, around day 9, when I sat with all of this evidence spread across my kitchen table, the investor deck, the cosigner form, the photographed receipts, Marisol's notes, all of it arranged in neat, deliberate stacks like something out of a case file, and I cried. Not because I was afraid of Trent, and not even fully because of what he'd tried to do to me. I cried because I understood, looking at that spreadsheet with my own last name reduced to a line item labeled restaurant equity leverage, that my daughter had married a man who saw both of us the way Deb once had, as an asset to be managed or a liability to be minimized, but never, not once, as people whose dignity mattered more than whatever he needed from us. I cried because some part of the 17-year-old girl who raised a baby above a laundromat still lived inside me, and she had hoped, so hard, for so long, that her daughter would never have to learn what it feels like to be someone's leverage instead of someone's love. I let myself have that one night. I sat at that table until nearly 2 in the morning, and I let the crying come in waves the way grief does when it's still fresh enough to surprise you, and then I washed my face, put the folder back together, and went to bed. And the next morning I went back to work. We chose the venue for the confrontation carefully and deliberately because Marisol had taught me that where you deliver hard truth matters almost as much as what the truth is. Corwin was hosting what he called an investor appreciation dinner the following Saturday, a formal event at a private event space downtown with roughly 30 guests, most of them the exact kind of family and friends investors Marisol's research suggested Ashby Capital had been quietly courting for months. Trent was set to give a short toast that evening, thanking early supporters and previewing the fund's next phase of growth. It was, in other words, precisely the room where he intended to solidify his credibility in front of the largest audience yet. I did not go to disrupt a dinner out of spite. I went because a room full of people about to hand over their savings to a fund built partly on fabricated financial leverage deserved to know the truth before, not after, they wrote checks they couldn't get back. And because Isla deserved to hear it in a setting where the evidence would speak for itself, rather than in our kitchen where it would simply become another argument between her mother and her husband that she'd have to referee. We arrived at 7:50 in the evening, Marisol and I, both of us dressed the way we dress for any professional dinner. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announced intention. I had brought a folder, unremarkable, the kind anyone might carry to a business dinner, containing copies of everything: the investor deck page, the cosigner form with its blank signature line, Priya's written statement about the receipts, and a printed bank statement showing, in black and white, the actual balance and history of the restaurant's corporate account. The one Trent had publicly declared declined in front of 5 people less than 2 weeks earlier. Corwin was mid-toast when we walked in, standing near the head table with a glass raised, saying something about believing in people before the market catches up to them, and Trent was seated beside Isla, beaming in the specific way of a man watching his own myth be recited back to him by someone he'd successfully convinced. I did not interrupt the toast. I waited, standing quietly near the back with Marisol, until Corwin finished and the applause settled and people returned to their conversations, and then I walked forward, calmly, folder in hand, and I said, loud enough for the immediate tables around Trent to hear but not loud enough to feel like a scene, because I had learned, finally, completely, that the calmest voice in a room commands more attention than the loudest one. Trent, before anyone signs anything tonight, there's something every person at this table has a right to see. The room did that thing rooms do when something unplanned enters them, a ripple of attention moving outward from the center, like a stone dropped in still water. Trent's face did the recalibration I'd seen once before, at the restaurant, except this time there was no audience of associates to perform for, only the growing awareness that the audience was suddenly watching him instead of with him. Renata, what is this? He said, and his voice had the particular tightness of someone trying to sound amused while doing rapid math behind his eyes. I opened the folder and set the first page on the table in front of him, gently, the way you'd set down something fragile. This is a line from Ashby Capital's investor projections, I said. It lists $180,000 in anticipated leverage against restaurant equity, attributed to you. I own that restaurant outright. I never authorized any leverage against it, to you or anyone. So I'd love for you to explain to everyone here where that number came from. Those are preliminary projections. That's not final. That's just modeling. Corwin does modeling for all kinds of scenarios. Trent started, and I recognized, with something close to relief, that Marisol had predicted this exact phase almost word for word. Denial. Deflection to context. I let him finish, and then I set the second page down. This is a business loan cosigner form, I said, with my daughter's name typed into the applicant field, found in my own office, that you never disclosed to me. I'd love for you to explain why my 19-year-old daughter's signature was being prepared for a loan connected to my business without my knowledge. The room had gone properly quiet now. Corwin had stopped moving. Isla, and this is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life, longer than I'll remember the declined card, longer than I'll remember anything else about that night, turned to look at Trent with an expression I had never once seen on her face before. Not confusion, not embarrassment, but the specific, terrible dawning of someone realizing that a person she trusted completely has been quietly building something behind a door she didn't know existed. Trent's second stage arrived almost instantly, the pivot Marisol had warned me about. Isla, baby, this is a misunderstanding. I was going to talk to you about the loan program. It's totally standard for family businesses. Your mom's just... And here, in front of Corwin, in front of 30 guests, in front of his own wife, he made the mistake that ended him, the mistake nobody had to manufacture for him, because he manufactured it himself out of panic. She's just being dramatic, because she's always resented that I actually think bigger than a restaurant. Bigger than a restaurant. I watched those 3 words land on Isla's face like a physical thing. I watched them land on Corwin's face too, because Corwin, whatever else he was, understood in that instant that his prize investor recruiter had just, in public, mocked the very asset his own investor deck had been quietly counting on. And I watched them land on the faces of two of the guests at the nearest table, an older couple I didn't know, who exchanged a glance with each other that told me everything I needed to know about whether they'd still be writing a check that evening. I did not raise my voice. I set the third page down, the bank statement, and I said, "This is the actual balance of the account you told 5 people 2 weeks ago was declined. It's never been declined. Not once, in 5 years." I'd invite anyone here considering an investment tonight to ask themselves what else has been described to them that isn't quite what it seems. That was when the authority figure arrived, though not one I'd planned or invited. A man near the back of the room, whom I later learned was a compliance attorney Corwin had retained specifically because of the earlier securities cease and desist, stepped forward, I think instinctively, the way people trained in liability step forward when they sense a room about to become a legal problem, and said, quietly but clearly enough for the tables around us to hear, "I'd recommend we pause any commitments tonight until this is fully reviewed." 5 words that, delivered by someone whose entire job was managing risk, did more to end Trent's evening than anything I could have said myself. I want to tell you what happened after that because the aftermath matters as much as the confrontation, maybe more. I did not stay to watch Trent unravel further. I did not gloat, did not linger for the satisfaction of watching Corwin's face as he realized his family and friends round had a hole blown through its credibility in front of 30 potential investors. I put the folder back together, quietly, and I told Isla, just her, quietly, my hand on her arm, "Whenever you're ready to leave, I'll drive you. No rush." And then Marisol and I stepped outside into the parking lot, and I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, just still. Processing. The night air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, that particular electric heaviness before a summer storm, and I could hear cicadas somewhere past the parking lot, steady and indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. The unexpected emotion that arrived, sitting there, wasn't victory. It was grief for the version of Trent I'd let myself believe in for a year and a half, the one who complimented Isla's cooking and hugged me goodbye at the door, because some part of him, I still believe, actually meant those small kindnesses, even while another part of him was building a spreadsheet with my life's work reduced to a line item. People can hold both. That's the part nobody tells you, the part that makes this so much harder than a simple villain would. I felt exhausted. The specific exhaustion of having performed normal Sunday dinners for 11 days while carrying a folder of evidence in my mind the entire time. And underneath all of it, quietly, I felt something like relief that my daughter had learned the truth in a room full of witnesses instead of alone in a kitchen, arguing with a man skilled enough to make her doubt her own mother. Isla came out to the parking lot 20 minutes later, alone. She got into my car without a word, and she cried for a long time, not loudly, just steadily, the kind of crying that comes from a person recalibrating an entire year and a half of memory in real time. I didn't say "I told you so." I didn't say anything at all for a long while. I just drove and let her cry, and when she finally spoke, she said, "How long have you known?" "About 11 days, I said. "I needed to be sure before I said anything to you. I didn't want you choosing between believing me and believing him with nothing solid to stand on." She nodded, looking out the window, and then she said something that undid me more than anything from that entire night. "You could have just told him off at the restaurant. In front of everyone. Why didn't you?" "Because that would have been about my pride," I told her. "And this was never about my pride. It was about you not marrying a lie, without at least having the chance to see it clearly first." We didn't talk much more after that. I drove her back to my house instead of her apartment without either of us discussing it out loud, and she slept in her old room that night, and I sat up for another hour in the kitchen, not doing anything in particular, just letting the house be quiet around me the way it hadn't been quiet in 11 days. Corwin's fund collapsed within 6 weeks. Once the compliance attorney's caution registered with the room, and once word spread, the way word always spreads in small investor circles, that Ashby Capital's projections included fabricated leverage attributed to a family member who'd never consented to it, the securities division, already primed by the earlier cease and desist, opened a formal inquiry. I don't know all the details of what happened to Corwin legally, because Marisol stopped tracking it closely once it moved past the parts that concern me directly, but I know that the private event space where the dinner was held sent me, months later, an odd little postscript of a story. Corwin's deposit for a follow-up event had bounced, and they'd had to chase him for it through a collection service. Sometimes the bottom is the only honest place for some people to finally start being accountable for something. Trent and Isla separated 4 months after that night. Not immediately. There was a period, painful to watch, where she tried to believe his explanations, tried to find a version of a story where he'd simply made an ambitious mistake rather than a calculated one, because that is what love does. It looks for the kindest possible reading of the person you chose. I watched her go through that period with more patience than I felt, honestly, because I understood that she needed to arrive at the truth in her own time, on her own terms, rather than have it handed to her fully formed by her mother, even a mother who'd already proven she was right. There were nights she called me in tears saying maybe she'd overreacted, maybe the loan form really was just a misunderstanding, maybe the investor deck really was just preliminary modeling like he'd said. I listened. I didn't argue. I just asked, each time, gently, what does your gut say, when you're not trying to talk yourself out of what it's telling you? And each time, eventually, she'd go quiet, and then she'd say something like, "It says I already know." She filed for divorce in the fall. Last I heard, secondhand, through someone who knew someone, Trent had moved into a shared apartment across town and was working a sales job that had nothing to do with capital or leverage or any word ending in growth. Sometimes the bottom really is where honest rebuilding starts if a person is capable of it. I hope, in some private corner of myself I don't examine too closely, that he is. But that's his work to do, not mine to witness anymore. Isla moved back in with me for about 5 months while she got her footing, and those months, strange as it is to say, are some of the ones I treasure most from this entire ordeal. We'd sit in the kitchen at night, the same kitchen where I'd cried alone over a spreadsheet, and she'd help me with the restaurant's books, and somewhere in those months, she stopped seeing Marchetti's as her mom's little Italian place and started seeing it as what it actually was, a fortress I'd built with my bare hands, one that had ultimately been strong enough to protect both of us. She started asking real questions, the kind that come from genuine curiosity rather than politeness, how I'd negotiated the original lease, how I'd learned to read a P&L, why I'd refused certain loans even when the terms looked generous on the surface. I watched something in her shift during those conversations, a kind of ownership settling into her that I don't think she'd ever fully felt before, not about the restaurant, and maybe not about herself either. It's been just over a year now since that night at the investor dinner. Isla has her own apartment again, a small one, closer to the restaurant, and she works front of house at Marchetti's 3 nights a week alongside finishing her degree, and there's a specific small joy I get every single time I watch her walk a table through the specials with the exact easy confidence I used to have to fake at her age. On Saturday mornings, she comes by early before her shift, and we split a pot of coffee at the small table in the back office, the same office where I found that blank cosigner form, and we talk about nothing important, a show she's watching, a customer who left a strange review, whether we should update the wine list. The bathtub in my house finally got replaced last spring, nothing fancy, just simple and white, and I remember standing in the doorway one morning with my coffee looking at it, thinking about how something so small can mean something so large when it arrives after a year like the one I'd just had. I still drive the same used sedan I bought 6 years ago. I still wear the same 3 aprons in rotation. I don't say any of this to sound humble for effect. I say it because the point of this whole story, if it has one single point, is this. Money did not change Trent. It revealed him. And dignity, the quiet, unglamorous, undramatic kind, was worth more to me in that parking lot than any satisfaction I could have gotten from screaming at him across a dinner table 2 weeks earlier when I first had the chance. If you're watching this and something in it landed a little too close to your own life, I want to say a few things directly to you because I think you deserve them plainly. If you're a mother watching an adult child get quietly diminished by someone they love, and you don't yet have proof, only instinct, trust the instinct, but do the work before you speak. Instinct without evidence can be dismissed. Instinct with evidence cannot. If you're an adult child watching a parent get taken advantage of, or worse, being asked to look the other way, you are allowed to ask hard questions, even of people you love. Especially of people you love. Loving someone has never meant staying silent while they're being used. If you're someone who's been building something with your own two hands for years, and someone in your life has started referring to it as little, or cute, or sweet, pay attention to that word. People rarely diminish things they don't secretly need something from. If you're carrying all the family's real financial weight quietly, the way I did for years before anyone in my life fully understood what it took, I see you. That weight is invisible to almost everyone around you until the day it isn't, and even then, some people will still find a way to make it feel small. If you're in the middle of the hard part right now, still performing normal dinners while carrying a folder of doubt in your chest that nobody else can see yet, I want you to know that the performance is not dishonesty. It's patience. And patience, done carefully, protects the people you love more than premature honesty ever could. And if you loved someone correctly, fully, generously, and they still acted incorrectly toward you, please hear this clearly. Those are two completely separate facts. You loved correctly. They acted incorrectly. One does not cancel out the other, and one is not your fault because of the other. Here is one practical thing you can do this week. If any part of this story felt like your own life, wearing a different name, pull your last 3 bank and account statements, personal or business, and read every individual line item, not just the totals. If you have a joint account, a shared card, a co-signed document sitting somewhere you haven't looked at in months, look at it now. You are not being paranoid. You are being awake. And there is a difference between the two that only becomes obvious in hindsight, which is exactly why it's worth checking before hindsight is the only option you have left. I'll leave you with this question because I think it's the one worth carrying home tonight. Is there a part of your life right now where you're making yourself smaller? Your work, your worth, your name, so someone else can feel bigger standing next to you? And if there is, how much longer, exactly, do you plan on letting that arrangement stand? If this story meant something to you, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop a 1 in the comments if you'd have handled that dinner table exactly the way I did, quiet, patient, evidence first. Drop a 2 if you think you'd have said something sooner and you want to tell me why. And drop a 3 if some part of this story touched something real and specific in your own life, something you haven't necessarily said out loud to anyone yet. Tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is there right now. Someone always watches these videos at 2 in the morning, somewhere I would never expect, and somehow it turns out to be exactly the story they needed that night. That means something to me every single time I read it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, locations, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your real life too closely, please reach out to a licensed attorney, a financial counselor, or someone you trust to help you look at the paperwork clearly. You are not alone in this. And remember, sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with a crash. Sometimes it's just a quiet sound you finally stop ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.